Firstly, wanted to welcome everybody from London. Jenny and I have discussions around what the real Stratford is, because I'm based in Stratford in London and Jenny in Stratford upon Avon, so we often have discussions around that. So welcome from the two Stratfords in the UK. I wanted to start basically before Jenny explains obviously how PharmaLex are leveraging the technology, just talking a little bit about the preparation of regulatory content for inclusion and submission in general, and kind of just an intro to the platform that Jenny is obviously going to kind of talk about in more detail and how it's been implemented there. So just wanted to start off with some kind of a discussion around preparation of regulatory content for submission use. What I'm going to do, there's a lot of industry talks at the moment about, use of data, shift from a document-centric approach to a data-centric approach, which is obviously important topics within the industry. But obviously documents, it's not all about the data just yet. There's still a lot of need for content related, especially in the submission space. It's still a very document-centric activity that obviously takes up a significant amount of time in preparing that content as well at various points. So what we're going to look at here really are the two parts of it, the technology part, which I'll do an introduction to, and obviously Jenny's going to talk about the process that's been wrapped around that technology to help sort of PharmaLex's customers as well. So really with the aim of producing and simplifying kind of how submission content is prepared, making it faster, and hopefully with less risk as well. So if we just take a typical document lifecycle, just a simple step-by-step, and again, there's obviously sort of variances of this kind of flow. But if you take sort of the initial content being authored by your medical writers or other authors of the content, using Word tech as well, kind of authoring it, reviewing, updating in Word. At various points in the life cycle, that document may well then be rendered or converted into PDF, which is obviously the beginning of preparing that content for inclusion in a submission. That PDF has to be prepared though, however, because often the raw rendition, the raw PDF file isn't really ready yet to share with the health authority. There's other technical elements and bookmarks, etc., that need to be incorporated. So that PDF has to be prepared before it gets included in the dossier itself or dossiers. There's typically then a draft published done, at which point you can begin validating not only the submission, but the individual documents potentially as well, the components of the dossier as well, to make sure they comply with the different health authority requirements. Obviously, the problem becomes a little bit larger when multiple health authorities are involved. You may have the same content obviously being included in the same submission for multiple health authorities. So again, the beginning steps are similar, the author reviewing, updating in Word, kind of getting converted into PDF. But that PDF then has to be prepared for potentially multiple health authorities with slightly different technical requirements on the PDF. They may be 90% the same. There are typically some variances between different health authorities as well. So you have to prepare multiple PDFs, even though the source document is the same. Those multiple PDFs are then incorporated into your different submissions, draft published, validated, etc. as well. So obviously the problem becomes exponentially larger the more health authorities that are involved. The kind of things we're talking about in terms of that preparation, the PDF compliance piece, where I say they vary, there's obviously a lot of elements that you're having to prepare for. So making sure that once a PDF is generated, the bookmarks are correct. There's obviously various specifications and requirements for how many levels of bookmarks you should have, how many should be open when you first open up the PDF. Various hyperlink kind of requirements around the color of the hyperlink, making sure that the hyperlinks and bookmarks are set to inherit zoom. You have tables of contents where they're required. You don't have blue text that isn't actually a hyperlink. It's maybe just a placeholder for where hyperlinks should be added later. No web links, etc. as well. There's various things from a technical side as well around the properties of the documents, the PDF version, how large the PDF file size is to ensure it doesn't exceed kind of recommended size limits. A lot of headache around ensuring fonts are embedded in the right way once they're converted to PDF, making sure they're embedded in the correct manner and completely. Your initial view settings, so when you open the PDF up, it's obviously opened in the way that the reviewers are expecting it to be as well. So lots of detailed requirements, and some of them do differ slightly from one health authority to another. Obviously, in terms of fixing those things manually, obviously you're potentially using tools like Acrobat just out of a box, to sort of make changes to zoom levels, whatever it may be, add additional bookmarks, and so on. You may have third-party plugins and tools to help you with that somewhat, but ultimately they're all either manual or at best semi-manual kind of processes, or batch, if you like, processes that obviously are long-winded. And especially when you're having to produce, multiple PDFs from the same source document with slight differences, obviously that problem again gets multiplied. Some of the items you may identify, obviously if you're identifying it at a PDF, some of them can be adjusted at a PDF level. Some of them you have to go back to the original source to resolve as well. So you may have items that it would be nice to be able to identify at a source level. You may have incorrect section numbering, blue text that shouldn't really be there, or web links included, padded spaces in headings, and images not in line with the text, tables that are not fitting the width of the page, so font sizes become too small, etc. as well. So obviously some issues you can resolve at a PDF stage, some issues you may have to go back to source to resolve as well. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the impact might be, so if I take an example of having just three individual source documents, and which are converted then to PDF in a standard way. If this is a typical process without kind of a full automation, this is more of a manual process that I'm showing you. You have three individual PDFs that then have to be prepared for, I'm just taking an example of for 5 different health authorities. So you have 5 different versions of the PDF created to meet the specs of the individual health authorities. Some of them may be exactly the same, some of them may be slightly different, but ultimately you need to make sure they meet the needs of everywhere where that document will be included. Obviously, you need to check that they're submission ready, resolve any issues at the PDF stage, include those individual documents in the submission, and do a draft publish of those submissions, validate the submission. And to that point, before you resolve any issues, you're already looking at, just for 3 documents, about 86 steps at a very high level. And again, this process obviously can differ slightly, but ultimately, taking that simple example, it's a lot of steps that are involved even before you go repeat, or you have multiple checks and fixes that are required. If you just take 1 resolution per document, you're already talking about 116 steps at the end of the day to do it manually. So just taking those 3 documents for 5 health authorities at a high level, you're talking about roughly over 100 steps in the process. Obviously, the idea is to try to automate it. So in this case, Arnie's wrong. Obviously, he wants to do it in batch, but the whole idea is really to try to move as much as you can from manual or batch process to something that's more fully automated as well, if you can. Obviously, the automation ensures that, 1, you remove as many manual steps in the process as you can, giving you more control over the results. Anything that involves manual steps, you lose a little bit of control, which leads to obviously inconsistency in the results, which also introduces an element of risk as well. It's also a lot easier if it's a fully automated process to incorporate that into, depending on your repository, your content management system platform, obviously allows you to integrate it into an automated, wider life cycle, if you like, for your content, which ultimately can lead to quite considerably reduced QC time. And hopefully, as I say, Jennie later on will explain kind of how that process has been used to change the way PharmaLex are working too. So if we take DocShifter, in terms of the rendering capabilities, just to explain as a concept, you often think of rendering as being just purely a conversion from one format to another. And while that's obviously a large part of it, taking content from basically any source repository, from any original file format, converting it into obviously whatever format's needed is one thing, but you can incorporate other elements as well to help automate other steps in the process, rather than just a conversion. Also automating when documents need to be OCR'd, when they need to be made text searchable, because the original content is a scanned image. It has no searchability in there as well, which is obviously one of the requirements, if you like, for content being submitted to health authorities. You can also incorporate things like headers and footers. If you've got scanned content, you may want to apply a header and footer to give it some context as well. You can apply watermarks. So while the document's going through its life cycle, you may want to have draft watermarks applied. You may author at a more granular level than is required by the CTD. So you may merge multiple documents together. You can either do that manually as part of your publishing process, or ultimately also as part of your rendering process to automatically merge multiple component documents into single files that ultimately create the correct granularity level, if you like, for the CTD. Same thing with bookmarks, obviously ensuring that you have bookmarks as automated as possible, so you're not doing that manually. Obviously ensuring you can sort of bookmark regardless of the styles, etc., in the content, and tables of contents applied automatically as well. Also making sure that there's no security remaining, so that when the content is reviewed, they have trouble opening the document up. Obviously, it's a requirement there as well. And then ultimately, you're creating one or more compliant documents at the end. So it's not a case of one document in, one document out. It's one document in, however many documents you need to submit out. And so you could have multiple files created with slightly different specs, slightly different flows going through the workflow as well. So again, it's not just a conversion, it can incorporate other steps and elements in there also. At the same time, it can be used for other purposes like preparing the content for an electronic archive. As well as submission use, that content at some point will often need to be pushed in, stored in a digital archive. And the file formats are potentially slightly different. They may be TIFF or they may be PDF-A, but ultimately not necessarily the same format that you're having to submit in. So at the same time as you're preparing your submission content, you can also prepare a version of that content for inclusion in a longer term storage as well. So all that can be fully automated as part of the process, as well as preparing it in formats where content can be extracted, prepared for artificial intelligence platforms, etc. as well. It can be PDF, and that's the main focus, but ultimately it can be other formats if need be. The slight loop that you see at the bottom is really in terms of validating the content. So even before you convert anything, it's possible to check for any issues with the source content. If it's a Word file, checking for issues within the source document. And if it's a PDF file, either generated by DocShifter or whoever else has generated and shared the PDF with you, being able to sort of check against sort of various criteria that produce a report that tells you, is that submission really ready to be included in, is that document ready to be included within a submission? So all the criteria around the version, any issues you might have in the PDF, have a nice checklist that actually goes through and says, yep, here's a report that tells you, summarizes any problems that may remain and they need to be resolved as well. So ultimately, all of that can be fully automated. So it's beyond just converting the content. It can incorporate other elements that may be manual or semi-manual today. The ultimate aim really is to take one source document, as it says, using DocShifter, then produce multiple PDFs depending on how and where that content is going to be submitted. So if we take the example we had before, where we had 86 steps or 116, depending on if it was including any issue resolution. If I take that same example with the 3 documents, and then I render it fully automatically to create a fully compliant rendition right out of the bat without any need to kind of fix it afterwards. So we take those steps out via automation, and then include those documents in the submissions and publish, take it through the validation step and resolve. We've kind of gone from over 80 steps down to about 38, and including one issue resolution beyond that, which hopefully there should be less of because you've automated, there's no manual elements involved. So hopefully those issues that arise because of manual steps in there, which you often some point in the future have to tweak and adjust later on. If you take some of those out, hopefully the number of extra steps is less anyway. There we're down to around 70 steps instead of over 110. So just using that as an example where automation can drastically, significantly reduce the number of steps in your process. The idea really being in that flow is instead of having to really not being able to fully validate or achieve compliance for your individual pieces, the content, quite late on, either after you've done a lot of preparation or potentially not until after you've done a draft submission, created a draft publish, you really should be able to achieve it at the point that you render. That document that comes out should be able to be fully technically compliant and ready to share with the health authority. Not just submission ready, but almost as if it's gone through the publishing tool to make it truly technically compliant and ready to share. Just take a few examples, just so this isn't just conceptual, but I'll take an example here of how you could leverage metadata from your document management system to help with the automation. I'm using one example with SharePoint, but ultimately the same concept applies regardless of the repository you're using. So in this case, what I've got is I've got content coming into one repository, and here it's a SharePoint. And I basically want to use metadata to figure out which countries I need to create a rendition for, to which specifications. So I'm going to leverage metadata to check if I need an FDA compliant PDF, if I need an EMA compliant one, a PMDA, Swissmedic, or Health Canada. So I'm going to do 5 checks. What I'm going to do is leverage metadata from SharePoint in this case, just looking at some properties within my SharePoint environment, basically just to check that somebody's making in here saying this document that's being created will be submitted to these health authorities. So I'm just capturing that as metadata within the SharePoint environment in this case. And I'm then using the system to check the value of that metadata. In this case, if it's true, I'm going to say I want to create a rendition to meet that spec, in this case, the FDA spec. If it's false, obviously I ignore it and I don't create an FDA version in this case. If I say yes, I want FDA, I then basically have a whole set of attribute set for how that PDF will be generated. So the FDA PDF will be generated based on the configuration that I make for my FDA PDFs within the environment. So the way I bookmark and everything will be specific and meeting the FDA guidelines. Just taking one example with Japan, PMDA, the one difference here, same checks. If I wanted a Japanese rendition created, only difference here might be that perhaps the way I create my bookmarks might be different. Maybe I create group bookmarks, so my tables and figures, I want them to be grouped at the end of my bookmark tree rather than scattered throughout the bookmarks. So I'm basically doing the same thing, same rules apply, but when it's a Japanese PDF, I'm going to bookmark it in a different way, along with some other potential option differences there as well. So just to show you what those results might be like, and I've opened up my bookmarks here to show you what that slight difference would make. I've ultimately got for the US rendition, I have my tables and figures scattered throughout. And I know this is not a fully compliant kind of text here, but ultimately to show you my tables, figures would be, within the context of the bookmarks, the other bookmarks around it, all the other headings. So to kind of show you in that tree as normal, as you'd expect. In Japan, in the other case example, the same source document exactly, the results are slightly different in the way that that PDF has been bookmarked for the PMDA compliant rendition. So in this case, I've got my tables all grouped at the end of my bookmark tree rather than scattered throughout it. So just kind of showing you how same source document, different PDFs generated depending on where that content needs to be shared. So that's just one example. Another example being automating fixing Word kind of issues. So you may have issues with your Word content, your original source. So rather than rendering a document that has issues with it, you can ultimately resolve some automatically as part of a workflow as well. So you may have issues with hyperlinks, you may have section numbers that are out of sequence, watermarks remaining, tables not fitting the page width, padding spaces, empty paragraphs, comments still existing in the document, images with text that's not in line. Things like that can ultimately be fully automated and fixed as part of a flow. So ultimately, rather than rendering it, you could have the system automatically fix various elements of the original document. Again, fully automatically, no user interaction, just as part of an automated workflow as part of your document life cycles. That's another use case for it. Another thing, obviously, is then ensuring you've got PDF compliance. So in this case, you may just at the end want to have a nice checklist that actually summarizes various checks you normally perform manually on your PDFs. So we basically can produce a nice report that summarizes all the checks around, the file size, the text is searchable, initial page views are correct, your bookmarks, you don't have any broken links or bookmarks that don't point anywhere, etc. So various checks you can perform, and it tells you whether each of those checks passes or fails. So it's an automated checklist, if you like, for your content preparation at a PDF level. And then it kind of goes into detail of where those issues are and what the problem is exactly. Just another example of kind of how you can automate that. the kind of nirvana, if you like, of the end-to-end scenario of taking a document and taking it from original source all the way through to the end. A full end-to-end process could be where a rendition is requested of an original Word document. You basically check if you want to fix that document or not. There could be a property in your DMS that says, should you or should you not attempt to fix it automatically? If you say no, it just basically runs a report that tells you any issues that it's found in the source document, generates a report, and that can then be accessed by somebody to see what issues remain. If you've said you want to fix it fully as well, it takes a different route. It creates a report. It basically looks at the Word document, automatically creates a fixed version of that document, and stores the fixed version back in the repository that it came from, either as a new version or as a separate document. As well as that, it then creates a compliant PDF rendition of that fixed document and stores that rendition back in your repository, either as a rendition or again as a separate file. And then that PDF rendition is then actually has a report generated, like I just showed you, that basically has a report summarizing whether or not it meets all the expected kind of criteria for your PDF content. And that report is then generated and stored somewhere as well. Again, so fully automatically, you could go from a source, fix the source, render the fixed document, store the results out, and you have reports along the way that kind of summarize what it did throughout that process as well. So just giving you a few examples of how the tech can be leveraged in different ways. And ultimately, the whole goal of DocShifter as a platform is really to help you streamline your processes for content preparation, really accelerate your content preparation, especially useful if you've got global submissions, but equally valid even if you're just submitting to one health authority. But obviously it becomes an exponentially larger saving when you're dealing with global submissions. Ultimately with the aim of achieving content compliance earlier in your process, helping you identify issues earlier and be able to resolve them before, with the ultimate aim of reducing your risk from content-related issues within your process. So I just want to give you that as a brief intro, and obviously Jenny will go through exactly how PharmaLex are leveraging the tech in specific ways as well. So I want to thank you for your time and pass over to Jenny at this point.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, thanks very much for giving that overview of DocShifter and also to handing over to someone who is in the real Stratford in the United Kingdom. So welcome to everybody. It's really good to get the opportunity to talk to everybody today. And the purpose of the presentation that I'm going to be giving is to just share with you the story that PharmaLex have had with working with DocShifter. Our journey to choosing DocShifter started probably at the start of 2020. And what I want to do is do some scene setting really before I jump in and explain exactly what it is that we've done with DocShifter within PharmaLex. And go back and take a look at why we've chosen to implement DocShifter and what were our triggers for doing that. And I'm not going to go through these two graphics. They're really there to illustrate the difference in our regulatory systems landscape that we had prior to 2020 and where we are now and where we want to continue to be in the future. And I don't know how many of you have followed the PharmaLex story, but over the years, PharmaLex has gone through lots of acquisitions. And obviously with that come a lot of regulatory systems that don't necessarily talk to each other, don't necessarily do the same thing. And we ended up with a lot of disparate systems. We had multiple publishing tools, for example. We were getting documents from our clients through different methods. Some would be sharing them with us via Box or ShareFile. Our publishers were storing documents in different secure locations. So what we wanted to do when we set out a project 2 years ago was to really streamline our regulatory systems. And the slide here on the graphic on the right hand side shows us where we are now and also where we want to continue to be. And we have two swim lanes on the slide, and the one that we're going to look at this afternoon is the second one, which is this internal one. So for some of our clients, they want us to manage and work with an entire portfolio of products and take on all the regulatory activities and also reg ops functions as well. And for those clients, we do have a vendor's end-to-end RIM solution that we use for those situations. But a huge amount of the work we do for our clients when we're publishing their regulatory submissions, we need to manage in some internal systems. So we've spent the last couple of years in creating and implementing global systems that are used by all of our publishers and our regulatory leads to make sure that we're focusing on simplification of our publishing process and that handover of documents from our client through a regulatory lead within PharmaLex and onto our publisher. But then also how we then hand back our published sequences back to our clients. And the way we built our roadmap is to really streamline everything as much as possible, so we're using the fewer systems that we can, and our systems can talk to each other. So I said this is all contained in this second swim lane here, and these are systems that we have developed in-house. But while looking at these systems, we really wanted to focus on the things that we thought we would get most benefit from, and one of those was pre-publishing. When I talk about pre-publishing, it's all the things that Paul has already been talking about, is making sure those PDF documents are submission ready and they'll be accepted by the health authorities when they're put into an ECTD sequence. We knew from talking to our publishers that actually preparing the documents was time consuming, very resource intensive, and this was definitely something that we wanted to automate, which is why we started having our conversations with DocShifter. So another little bit of background about our documents, and I think this was the biggest learning lesson for us when we were working through our project, is the type of documents that we get from our clients. And because we are a service provider, we work with many, many clients from around the world, and we therefore get lots of different types of quality documents to us. And I've tried to put them into 3 categories here, but in reality, we get a real mixture of all of these. I mean, our publishers' favorite documents are the Word documents. These can often be authored using a client's template. They're very well structured. They've got good formatting and styles. They've got headings in them, and they work, and they are the favorite documents of our publishers. We also then get some PDF documents handed to us by our clients, and some of these are very good quality and obviously have been converted from a Word document. And then the third category is those image PDFs, which also are handed to us from time to time, where we are given scanned documents and the PDF is handed to us as an image. So they're really the 3 different buckets that we have. But as I said, because of the variety of clients that we work with, we do see a combination of all different file types, and our systems and our processes then have that challenge of having to manage all of those different document types, which does cause us a few headaches. So when the regulatory lead has the documents ready that need to go into that submission, need to be published to ECTD, they will zip them into a zip file and they upload them to the submission record. And then automatically behind the scenes, so the regulatory lead doesn't see this happening, this is something that they sit back and the system does this. It unpacks the zip file and stores the documents in a secure repository. Those documents then are automatically sent to the DocShifter queue, and then DocShifter will process those documents to create submission-ready PDFs. And Paul already mentioned about using metadata in SharePoint to define what attributes need to be set against those PDFs. And so we're using that same principle as well within our submission management tool. So we know from our submission record which country those documents are going to be going to. And that country field is used to determine which DocShifter workflow is going to be used to process those PDFs. We actually only have 2 at the moment. We have a US workflow and we have a rest of world workflow. But that's something that we will look to expand in the future. But it knows that if those documents have been associated to a submission that's going to the FDA, it goes through the US workflow. If it's a document that's been associated to a submission record for anywhere else, it will go through our rest of world workflow. Then also behind the scenes, so once those submission ready PDFs have been created, they are zipped back up and automatically uploaded back into the submission record. And then the regulatory lead can let the publisher know, and the publisher can then download those documents and then go and prepare the ECTD sequence. But hearing what Paul's been talking about is the validating the source documents, I think that's definitely something we might want to look to do in the future to try and reduce the amount of review we need to do at this stage. And we already talked a little bit about the gains that we've had from having this tool, but it does mean that we had some people that spent their days preparing PDF documents ready to go into an ECTD sequence, and obviously those people can now be reallocated and build up their skills and work on some more complex publishing projects. What we are looking to do is to provide the most efficient, accurate service to our clients. And I think everyone can appreciate that with publishing, your timelines often get squeezed because we're right at the very end of a critical path we've got that submission date looming, but sometimes the documents are late coming over to us. So we need to make this process as simple and as streamlined as possible and as accurate as possible, so our clients are getting a really strong service from us. As I said, we are monitoring how we're using DocShifter, and we continue to try and plan for some more continuous improvements to make things more efficient and to identify where it's helping, but also where maybe it isn't helping quite so much, and we've had to do a little bit of rethinking. So during the period from October when we went live up to the end of December last year, that's what we were doing. We're looking at how, we've implemented this. Is it working? Do we need to make any changes? Do we need to give out some more advice to our users? And we did do some of that, and and then we're continuing to monitor that through January and February as well. So our future plans for DocShifter are looking at OCRing image PDFs. This is a big thing for us, and it's something that probably surprised us a little bit, is how many image PDFs we do get given by our clients. And actually, we realise that this is an issue not just for those regulatory submissions, but through other departments within PharmaLex who may be working with clients in PV or in quality who are receiving image PDFs. And so we want to be able to use DocShifter to OCR those PDFs automatically. And our ideal for this is to have an email service. Now, this may not be something we can do DocShifter standalone. It may be that we require our internal IT and developers to help us with some of the configuration on this. But what we would like to see is anybody within PharmaLex could have a number of image PDFs. They can zip those, attach them to an email, that goes off, DocShifter picks them up and then sends the email back to the person, and they get their nice text searchable OCR'd PDFs. So that's something that we are looking to work on. We're also, as a company, looking at our document management system. Again, because we are a service provider working for multiple companies, we may not use an EDMS as traditionally as a pharma company might do. So we have slightly different requirements. But we are looking at an EDMS, and that's a project that we're working on this year, and we want to have an EDMS system to go live. That will integrate with our submission tool, and therefore we do want to integrate that with DocShifter as well. And we've got some ongoing activities to do with how we're monitoring the use of DocShifter, just to see how effective it actually is. And I think based on what Paul was just talking about, I think the big thing for me coming out of Paul's slides there is to validate the documents at source. And I think that's something that we would really benefit from as well. So I may add that onto the list of things we want to do. And yeah, it's now time for our question and answer session.